In the quiet fields of South Carolina in 1827, where sermons echoed louder than reason and the church bell rang like the heartbeat of the town, a scandal brewed that no pulpit could ever cleanse. At the center of this hidden darkness stood Reverend Josiah Carter, a man praised on Sundays for his fiery words of salvation, yet damned in secret for sins too vile to speak aloud. The people of his parish looked up to him as a man of God, but inside the walls of his home he was a man shackled by gambling debts, pride, and a desperation that drove him to choices darker than the devil himself. Carter's debts were not small matters. His appetite for cards and drink had left him owing money to some of the most powerful men in the region. Merchants, landowners, and even local politicians had him cornered, and in those days, a man drowning in debt had few ways to surface. He could not face prison. He could not bear disgrace, and so the Reverend turned not to Scripture, not to repentance, but to the unthinkable. He used his daughters as currency. The Reverend had 3 daughters, all young, innocent, and raised under his strict roof. To his congregation, they were symbols of purity, quiet girls who sat dutifully in the front pew as their father thundered about sin and virtue. But behind closed doors, they were pawns in a twisted bargain. When creditors came knocking, the Reverend offered not gold, not land, but his daughter's virginity as payment. Each girl was promised to men many years their senior, men who looked at them not as children but as property, rewards for their silence, flesh in exchange for ink-stained ledgers. In the plantation south of 1827, whispers traveled faster than sermons. Servants noticed unusual visitors arriving at the Reverend's home late in the evening. Neighbors wondered why men of status who never attended his church suddenly took such interest in his family. The town itself seemed to know, but the Reverend's title as a man of God wrapped him in protection. Who would dare accuse the very man entrusted with their souls? His collar was his shield, and his daughters bore the cost. The girls lived in terror of what awaited them, but their voices were silenced by obedience and fear. To defy their father was unthinkable. To speak out would bring ruin not only on themselves, but on the very faith that had been weaponized against them. In the Reverend's eyes, this was survival. In theirs, it was betrayal of the deepest kind. As the years crept forward, tragedy stained the Carter household. One daughter, weakened and ill after a violent encounter arranged by her father, did not survive the winter. The townsfolk murmured of sickness, of God's will, but the truth was darker, whispered only in shadows. Another daughter fled, vanishing into the night with nothing but a torn dress and her prayers. Only one remained, broken yet bound to her father's house until his debts were finally paid. It was only long after the Reverend's death that the truth began to surface. Letters and records, hidden away in attics and trunks, told the story of a man who sold his daughter's innocence to preserve his pride. Names of prominent men appeared in these accounts, men who had smiled in public while indulging in private sins. These discoveries turned a once respected Reverend into a ghost of disgrace. His sermons remembered not for salvation but for hypocrisy. This is not just the tale of one man's corruption, but of an entire system that allowed it to thrive. It is the story of how religion, power, and desperation collided in South Carolina, and how the lives of 3 young girls were sacrificed for the debts of their father. Behind every hymn, behind every prayer, there was a silence screaming louder than any church bell, a truth too monstrous to speak. And yet history remembers, even when the town tried to forget. The scandal of Reverend Carter stands as one of the darkest reminders of the South's hidden past, a past where the very man meant to guide souls to heaven sold his own daughters to survive on. Earth, South Carolina in 1827 was a place where the church ruled over every corner of life. The people rose with the sun to work the land, and they ended their days on bended knees, listening to the words of men who claimed to carry God's truth in their voices. Among them stood Reverend Josiah Carter, a man whose fiery sermons could bring tears to the eyes of widows and fear to the hearts of sinners. To the townsfolk, Carter was more than a minister. He was the moral compass of their small community. His words rang out from the pulpit like thunder, condemning dishonesty, lust, and greed. He preached of salvation, of God's eternal mercy, and of the dangers of straying from righteousness. But the man behind the pulpit was not the man his congregation believed him to be. Josiah Carter carried within him a secret so black, so corrosive, that if spoken aloud, it would have shattered the very foundation of the church he led. His sermons may have been full of fire, but his private life burned with sin. The Reverend was drowning in debt. His taste for cards, dice, and strong drink had led him into the dens of Charleston, where gentlemen and thieves sat at the same table, risking fortunes over the roll of a hand. At first, Carter believed he could outwit them. After all, he was a man of intelligence and persuasion. But luck turned its back on him. Within months, he owed more than his yearly salary. Within a year, he was indebted to powerful men who showed no mercy to those who could not pay. In any other circumstance, such ruin might have ended a man's life. Debtor's prison was real, and disgrace was often worse than chains. For a reverend, disgrace would mean the loss of everything: his pulpit, his reputation, his very name. And so, rather than confess, rather than throw himself on the mercy of his God or his community, Carter chose to sink deeper into sin. His creditors came calling, not once, but many times. They were men of influence, merchants, planters, and judges, who had no use for excuses. They wanted payment, and they wanted it quickly. Carter had no gold, no land, and no possessions worth the sums he owed. But he did have daughters. 3 girls, the eldest barely 16, the youngest just entering womanhood, were all that he had left of his late wife, who had died years earlier. To the town, they were sweet, innocent children, faces of purity, seated every Sunday in the front pew, their heads bowed in reverence. But to Carter, in his desperation, they became currency. The decision did not come in a single night. It grew slowly, like rot in the beams of a house, eating away until collapse was inevitable. The first time the thought crossed his mind, he banished it with prayer. But as the weight of his debts grew heavier, prayer turned into bargaining, and bargaining turned into justification. What is a father, he asked himself, if not the protector of his family's future? Better to sacrifice their innocence than see them starve or live in disgrace. And so, with a trembling voice and a heart hardened by desperation, Reverend Carter approached one of his creditors with an unthinkable offer. The man, a wealthy planter, was taken aback at first, but soon greed and lust overtook his hesitation. A deal was struck. Payment would be delayed if Carter delivered his eldest daughter as part of the bargain. From that moment forward, the Reverend's life became a web of lies. To his congregation, he remained the same fiery preacher, condemning sin while committing it nightly in his home. To his daughters, he became a figure of fear, a man whose authority was absolute and whose decisions could not be challenged. The girls wept, begged, and prayed for escape, but obedience to their father was drilled into them from birth. Disobedience was sin, and sin was damnation. The town began to whisper. Servants spoke of strange visitors arriving at the Carter home under cover of darkness. Neighbors saw men lingering longer than was proper, slipping out at dawn with faces that betrayed more than mere business. Yet none dared to accuse the Reverend outright. His position shielded him. Who would dare bring charges against the very man tasked with saving their souls? The Reverend's secret was darker than any sermon he ever preached. He stood in the pulpit and thundered against lust, even as he sold his daughter's innocence behind closed doors. He warned of the fires of hell, even as he lit them within his own home. His words were chains binding his flock to obedience, while his actions broke the most sacred of trusts, that between a father and his children, and between a shepherd and his flock. As the years went on, his debts lessened, but the cost was immeasurable. His daughters bore the scars of betrayal, scars that no prayer could erase. One girl's health failed after childbirth, her body too young and frail for the burden forced upon it. Another fled, vanishing into the night, leaving behind only rumors of her fate. The youngest remained broken but bound, her future stolen before it had begun. Carter's secret would not stay buried forever. After his death, when letters and testimonies emerged, the scandal exploded like a storm. The same townsfolk who had once praised him now spat his name. His sermons, once remembered for their power, were recast as hypocrisy. His church, once a sanctuary, was now seen as a prison of lies. This first keynote, the simple fact that a respected reverend carried a secret darker than any sermon, was the foundation of the entire tragedy. For behind the image of holiness lay rot, and behind the mask of righteousness lay sin of the most unforgivable kind. The story of Reverend Josiah Carter is not just about one man's fall. It is about the dangerous power of unchecked authority, the silence of communities unwilling to question their leaders, and the horrifying lengths desperation can drive a man to reach. The town of Charleston, South Carolina, prided itself on civility, on the polished manners of its society and the guiding hand of the church. Yet behind the lace curtains and the polished wood of Reverend Josiah Carter's parlor, a darkness unfolded that none of his congregation could have imagined. What appeared to the world as a devout man of God, a shepherd guiding his flock, was in truth a gambler, a man whose lust for dice and cards was matched only by his terror of ruin. By 1827, his debts had grown monstrous, swallowing every coin he could scrape together, and still they demanded more. When the creditors began to circle like vultures, Josiah Carter turned his gaze inward to the only wealth he had left, his daughters. It began with whispers, quiet arrangements made in shadows. At first, the Reverend resisted, clutching his Bible with shaking hands, praying for strength. He knew what he contemplated was monstrous. The girls were innocent, unworldly, barely more than children. They trusted him completely, believed in his guidance, believed in the protection of the man who spoke of God's mercy every Sunday from the pulpit. But debt does not wait, and gamblers' promises are worth less than dust when the dice fall badly. The men who had lent Carter money were not patient men. They wanted satisfaction one way or another. Some threatened to expose him publicly, others threatened violence, and so, in his desperation, the Reverend gave in. The first arrangement was made in the stillness of night. His eldest daughter, Sarah, 16 years old and delicate in frame, was called into his study. She thought it was for prayer or for correction, as she had often been summoned before. Instead, her father spoke in words that chilled her blood. She was to visit one of his friends, a man who had been kind enough to lend her father money. She was to be polite, obedient, and above all silent. Sarah's protests were met with the thunder of his voice, the same voice that commanded obedience from 100 worshippers on Sundays. He told her this was her duty, that God demanded sacrifice, that family honor rested on her shoulders. She left his study weeping, but she obeyed. The man was twice her age, a planter with greedy eyes and rough hands who saw in Sarah not a child, but a commodity. That night broke her spirit, and though she returned home in silence, her innocence was forever gone. Carter, however, saw only the reprieve it purchased. His debts for the moment were held at bay. The gambler's noose loosened, and in his twisted mind, he began to justify his crime. Was it not better, he told himself, to give one night of a daughter's shame than to see the entire family ruined? Was it not a father's duty to preserve the household by any means necessary? But debts, like shadows, return with every setting sun. The reprieve was brief, and soon the creditors came again. One debt turned into two into three, until Josiah's desperate bargain became a pattern. Sarah was sent out more than once, and when her health began to fail, he turned his eye to the second daughter, Mary, only 14. She had her mother's looks, pale and graceful, and her very youth made her desirable to the men who trafficked in lust and cruelty. Mary resisted fiercely, clinging to her faith, begging her father not to send her. But her cries were silenced with scripture twisted from the pulpit. Obedience to one's father, submission to authority, sacrifice for the family. In the end, the Reverend's word was law, and she, too, was delivered into the hands of strangers. Behind closed doors, Carter had become a broker of innocence. Each time he sold his daughters, he cloaked the act in justification. He told himself it was temporary, that soon his debts would vanish, that he would repent and return to the light. But sin has a way of multiplying, and the more he bartered his children, the easier it became. The girls became little more than currency, tokens to be traded in a game of survival. Their tears did not move him, for he had hardened his heart against their cries. His sermons grew louder, his condemnations more fiery, as if by shouting against sin he could drown out the echo of his own. The townsfolk began to notice cracks in the Reverend's household. Sarah no longer smiled in the pews. Mary's eyes were downcast, her body frail. Neighbors whispered of strange men arriving late at night, staying far too long behind the parlor door. Servants carried rumors to other households, rumors of screams muffled by walls, of girls who wept until dawn. Yet none dared speak openly against Reverend Carter. His reputation as a man of God shielded him, and to accuse him of such acts would have been unthinkable. The daughters bore their suffering in silence, but silence does not erase scars. Sarah's health faltered. She grew thin, pale, her body weakened by nights she had not chosen. Mary's spirit cracked. She ceased speaking to her sisters, retreating into herself. Her prayers whispered like broken glass. The youngest, Anne, only 12, watched in terror as her elder sisters were taken one by one. She knew her turn would come, and the dread hollowed her childhood before it had even begun. Meanwhile, Carter's debts never truly disappeared. Gambling was a hunger that gnawed at him ceaselessly. Every reprieve bought by his daughter's innocence was wasted at the gaming tables. Each time he won, he believed salvation was within reach. Each time he lost, the cycle began anew. He was caught in a whirlpool of sin, dragging his daughters down with him, drowning them in shame for the sake of his own weakness. To the town, Reverend Carter remained a pillar, a man who thundered against lust and greed with righteous fury. Yet in truth, every word he spoke was a mask. Behind closed doors, he was the very embodiment of the sins he condemned, bartering his daughter's purity for the luxury of another roll of dice, another hand of cards. The hypocrisy was staggering, but as long as his secret remained hidden, he was safe. What none of them knew, not yet, was that secrets rot in the dark. The daughters' suffering could not remain invisible forever. Their broken health, their haunted eyes, their whispered prayers were seeds of revelation. One day the truth would burst forth, and when it did, the name of Reverend Josiah Carter would no longer bring thoughts of holiness, but of betrayal, of cruelty, and of sin so great it could never be washed away. In that year of 1827, in the silence of a small house in South Carolina, a father became his daughter's undoing. Behind closed doors, he sold their innocence piece by piece, thinking himself clever, thinking himself safe. But no man who trades his children's purity for the fleeting pleasure of a gambler's thrill can escape the judgment that waits. Not the judgment of men, not even the judgment of history, but the eternal judgment of God. The Carter household in 1827 looked from the outside like a place of order. The shutters were painted white, the porch swept each morning, and the smell of bread often drifted from the kitchen. Neighbors passing by might have envied the Reverend Josiah Carter for the quiet dignity of his home and the beauty of his 3 daughters. To them, the Carter girls seemed blessed, dressed modestly in pale gowns, their heads bowed in piety at every Sunday service. But inside the walls of that home, silence reigned, and fear grew like mold in the corners. For Sarah, Mary, and Anne, silence had become survival. They knew better than to speak of what their father demanded. They knew better than to ask why strange men with heavy purses arrived at odd hours, why their father's voice turned hard and sharp whenever debts were mentioned. They knew better than to question why their youth, their innocence, was treated as something to be given away when dice fell badly or cards turned against him. Each girl carried within her a terror too heavy for her age, and each learned quickly that tears brought no rescue, only harsher commands. Sarah, the eldest at 16, bore the heaviest weight. She had been the first to feel her father's betrayal, the first to be offered up as payment in his dark game. What had been taken from her in that first encounter could never be restored, and though she tried to stand tall for her sisters, her body and spirit betrayed her. She no longer laughed as she once had, no longer sang hymns in the morning light. Her eyes had grown shadowed, as if every night was another piece of her soul being stolen. When she sat at the supper table, she barely touched her food, and when she walked to church beside her father, she kept her gaze fixed on the ground. She carried her shame like a hidden scar, and though she wanted desperately to confide in someone, she dared not. The silence was safer. Mary, only 14, learned fear not by what had happened to her, but by what she knew was coming. She had watched Sarah return from those nights, pale and trembling, unable to meet anyone's eyes. She had heard muffled sobs through the wall they shared. She understood, even without words, what awaited her. The dread consumed her long before her father finally turned to her. Each evening as the sun sank, her stomach would knot, and she would whisper frantic prayers into the folds of her blanket. She prayed for deliverance, prayed that her father would find another way to satisfy the men who came to collect their dues. But the prayers went unanswered, and the day arrived when she too was summoned. That first night she fought, she cried, begged, even tried to run. But her father's hand was iron, his command unyielding. The fear that had haunted her dreams became her reality, and afterward she was never the same. Her voice became softer, her eyes hollow, her once lively spirit dimmed to a fragile ember. Anne, the youngest, only 12, was still untouched when the story began to unravel, but she was not spared from fear. She lived under its shadow, watching her sisters suffer and knowing with dreadful certainty that her time would come. Every creak of the floorboards at night made her heart race. Every knock on the door made her tremble. She grew anxious, withdrawn, clinging to her sisters, begging them to protect her. But Sarah was too broken, Mary too silent. They loved her, but they could not shield her. Anne lived every day waiting for the moment when her father would call her name, when the silence of fear would turn into the silence of shame. What united the sisters was their inability to speak. They could not tell their mother, for their mother's voice had been quieted long ago, her body weak from illness, her will shattered by years of her husband's cruelty. They could not tell the townsfolk, for who would believe them against the revered minister, the man who thundered from the pulpit about purity, chastity, and obedience. To accuse him would be to risk everything: scorn, disbelief, perhaps even violence. And so the daughters kept their secrets locked inside. They sat in pews each Sunday, their hands folded, their eyes lowered, while their father preached fire and brimstone to the congregation. Every word he spoke about sin was another knife twisting in their hearts, for they knew he was condemning publicly the very acts he forced upon them in private. The silence was a prison, but it was also a bond. At night, when the house grew still, the sisters would gather in whispers. Sometimes they cried together. Sometimes they prayed. Other times they simply sat in wordless company, the comfort of one another's presence the only balm they had. Their fear was immense, but in those quiet moments they found strength. Sarah would hold Anne's hand tightly, promising her, though she knew it was a lie, that they would never let their father touch her. Mary would brush Anne's hair, soothing her as though she were still a child. For those few moments, they pretended they were safe, but the silence could not hold forever. The weight of what they endured seeped into every corner of their lives. Sarah began fainting during chores, her body too frail to bear the burden. Mary grew bitter, her prayers dwindling, her eyes flashing with anger when their father's name was spoken. Anne grew restless, nightmares shaking her awake. They were girls who should have been dreaming of futures, of husbands chosen in love, of homes they might build. Instead, their futures were chained to the roll of dice, the flip of cards, the debts of a man who claimed to love them. The fear changed them in ways that would never be undone. It robbed them of childhood, stripped them of hope, and twisted their trust into suspicion. Every knock at the door was a threat. Every glance from a man in town felt like judgment. They could not confide in friends, could not seek the comfort of others, for their silence was both their prison and their protection. And through it all, their father moved with the assurance of a man untouchable, his reputation shielding him from suspicion. He used their innocence as casually as another man might spend coins, never once stopping to see the daughters he destroyed. In that home, the silence was louder than any cry. It echoed through the hallways, seeped into the walls, and wrapped around the sisters like a suffocating shroud. They lived with it, breathed it, carried it with them each day. Their innocence, once so natural and bright, had become nothing more than a bargaining chip in their father's dangerous game. And as the game continued, they began to understand what no child should ever know, that silence, once meant to protect, could just as easily destroy. In 1827, South Carolina was a place where appearances mattered more than truth, and silence was often stronger than justice. The Reverend Josiah Carter stood as a towering figure in the town, not because of kindness or wisdom, but because of the power his pulpit gave him. His words shaped belief, his sermons shaped morality, and his presence commanded respect. To challenge him was to risk not only ridicule but also exile from the very community that provided survival. And so, even as whispers spread like smoke from a hidden fire, the town kept its silence, swallowing suspicion rather than speaking it aloud. It began with murmurs, small and uncertain, drifting between neighbors on porches and over baskets at the market. Why did wealthy creditors visit the Reverend's house so often, their expressions grim when they arrived but satisfied when they left? Why did his daughters, once lively and bright, now walk the streets like shadows of themselves? And why did Sarah, the eldest, grow so thin and pale, her eyes refusing to meet the gaze of any man? The questions were many, but the answers were dangerous, and the people knew it. In the South of 1827, the church was the heart of the town. To doubt the minister was to doubt God himself in the eyes of many. The Reverend's sermons, fiery and relentless, kept the congregation in awe. He thundered about sin, about the devil's snares, about the dangers of vice and disobedience. He spoke with such conviction that no one dared imagine he might be guilty of the very sins he condemned. And yet behind closed doors, people whispered. They whispered about the strange hollowness in his daughters' faces, about the men who slipped into his home at odd hours, about the way his wife seemed to wither and fade into the background like a ghost. One neighbor, Mrs. Green, once confided to her sister that she had seen Mary Carter, the middle daughter, crying on the back porch late one evening, her dress rumpled, her face streaked with tears. She had wanted to comfort the girl, but the Reverend's voice rang out sharply from inside the house, calling Mary back in. Mrs. Green hesitated, torn between compassion and fear, before stepping away into the night. She never spoke of it to anyone else, for she knew the cost of gossip against the Reverend's name. One wrong word could ruin a family, and who would believe a woman over a minister? Men in town, too, carried suspicions. Some of them had dealings with the Reverend, and though he often preached of humility, he carried himself with arrogance. His debts were not unknown, and his gambling habit, though whispered quietly, was suspected by those who watched him too closely at gatherings. Yet no one dared confront him. To expose him would be to bring shame not only upon him but upon the entire town, for had they not sat beneath his sermons, had they not praised him as a man of God, to admit he was corrupt would be to admit their own blindness. And so they stayed silent, choosing willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth. The Reverend himself seemed to sense the whispers. He tightened his control over his congregation, condemning gossip in his sermons, warning against those who sought to divide the faithful. His voice grew harsher, his eyes sharper, as though daring anyone to question him. Fear became his shield and respect his weapon. Parents told their children not to speak ill of the Reverend. Wives cautioned husbands not to question his integrity. In this way, the town itself became complicit, protecting the very man they quietly suspected. Yet the girls carried the truth in their eyes, and some saw it, though they pretended not to. Sarah, once known for her gentle singing voice, no longer joined in hymns. Mary, who had once played with other children in the fields, now kept herself withdrawn, avoiding laughter, avoiding touch. Anne, the youngest, clung too tightly to her sisters, as though fearing they would be taken from her at any moment. These changes did not go unnoticed, but they went unspoken. To speak them aloud would make the whispers real, and no one wished to bear the burden of that truth. Still, the scandal lingered, like smoke that would not disperse. At gatherings, women exchanged glances when the Reverend's daughters appeared. Men muttered over ale about the Reverend's debts. Servants, more observant than their masters realized, whispered behind kitchen doors about what they had seen. Visitors leaving at dawn, the girls trembling, the Reverend counting coins with shaking hands. The town lived with the knowledge like a splinter buried deep in the skin, too painful to ignore, too dangerous to dig out. The power of silence was greater than justice. No one wanted to be the first to speak, the first to accuse, the first to risk the wrath of the man who held their souls in his sermons. And so the whispers never grew into shouts. The scandal never became an accusation. It lingered in shadows, carried from one pair of lips to another, but always in secret. The town chose ignorance over confrontation, fear over truth. The daughters bore the cost of that silence. For them, the whispers were no comfort. They felt the weight of eyes upon them, the pitying glances, the unasked questions. They knew that people suspected, that people wondered, and yet no one came to their rescue. Their suffering was visible to all, yet acknowledged by none. It was a betrayal as cruel as their father's sins. A betrayal of community, of faith, of humanity itself. By 1827's end, the Carter household remained intact, its walls hiding horrors the town refused to name. The Reverend still preached each Sunday, his voice booming across the pews. His daughters still sat in silence, their faces pale, their bodies frail. And the town still whispered, still suspected, still chose not to act. The scandal was known, yet never spoken, a secret buried beneath fear and obedience. In the end, it was not the Reverend alone who betrayed those girls. It was the silence of an entire town, the weight of a community's complicity, that deepened their suffering. And history, though it remembers the Reverend's sins, must also remember the whispers that were never turned into words, the truths that were never spoken aloud. Chapter 5 of this tragic story deals with the long-delayed reckoning of the Reverend's horrific crimes and the role that historical evidence played in revealing the full extent of his exploitation. While during his life, the Reverend successfully concealed his misdeeds behind a carefully maintained image of piety and respectability, the passage of time, combined with the eventual discovery of personal correspondence and documents, brought the truth to light. This chapter is significant because it shifts the narrative from secrecy, fear, and complicity to revelation, reflection, and historical accountability. During the 19th century, societal norms and hierarchies often allowed powerful men to evade scrutiny. In the Reverend's case, the combination of his religious authority, social standing, and the wealth of the men involved in accepting his daughters as payment created a shield against suspicion. While neighbors whispered about unusual visits and the family's peculiar circumstances, fear of confrontation, social pressure, and respect for religious authority prevented them from intervening. In essence, the abuse thrived not only because of the Reverend's actions, but because of the silence and compliance of an entire social structure. It was only decades later, through the careful examination of letters and personal records, that the reality of the Reverend's actions emerged. These letters, likely exchanged between the Reverend and his creditors, as well as among the wealthy men who accepted the daughters, provided irrefutable evidence of the transactions. They revealed not only the mechanics of the purity bargains, but also the identities of those involved. This documentation transformed rumors into facts, turning hearsay into historical proof. For the first time, the full scope of exploitation, including the complicity of societal elites, could be understood in detail. The significance of these letters extends beyond mere fact-finding. They also provide a window into the mindset of both the perpetrator and the enablers. The Reverend's language, tone, and meticulous recording of transactions demonstrate a cold calculation and a complete lack of empathy for his children. The letters reveal how he rationalized his actions, framing the exploitation as a necessary sacrifice for his survival while attempting to maintain appearances. Similarly, the correspondence from the men involved exposes a disturbing moral flexibility. Their willingness to accept young girls as collateral indicates a societal tolerance for exploiting power imbalances when financial or social gain was at stake. Chapter 5 also addresses the broader implications of these revelations. The uncovering of historical documents does more than just tell the story of one family. It sheds light on systemic issues in 19th century America. The power dynamics between men and women, parents and children, clergy and community all contributed to an environment in which abuse could occur unchecked. By examining the letters, historians and readers gain insight into the ways in which social, economic, and religious structures can interact to conceal wrongdoing. The Reverend's actions, while horrific, are thus not isolated. They are indicative of larger societal patterns that privileged wealth, authority and male dominance over justice, transparency, and the protection of the vulnerable. Importantly, Chapter 5 emphasizes the delayed nature of justice and truth. Because these crimes were hidden during the Reverend's lifetime, the victims, his daughters, never received societal acknowledgement or validation of their suffering while alive. Their fear, shame, and isolation remained unchallenged, leaving psychological and social scars that persisted beyond the immediate events. The eventual discovery of letters and records allowed historians to reconstruct the story and give voice to the victims posthumously. While the revelation could not undo the trauma, it ensured that history did not entirely erase the suffering inflicted. The chapter also explores the tension between memory and narrative. For decades, local history may have framed the Reverend as a respected religious figure, glossing over or ignoring whispers of misconduct. Community memory, often shaped by convenience, deference, or fear, can obscure difficult truths. The letters, as primary historical documents, challenge those selective memories and force a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. This aspect of the chapter highlights a crucial lesson. History is not merely a collection of stories passed down. It is an active process of uncovering evidence, questioning assumptions, and reconstructing events based on verifiable sources. Without such documents, the full extent of the Reverend's crimes might have remained hidden indefinitely. Chapter 5 also implicitly addresses the role of historians, archivists, and researchers in uncovering the past. It was through careful preservation, discovery, and interpretation of these letters that the narrative of exploitation could be told with accuracy. The chapter reminds readers that historical truth often depends on meticulous attention to detail and a willingness to confront disturbing evidence, even when it challenges cherished narratives about religious, social, or familial authority. In this sense, the chapter is both a recounting of events and a meta-commentary on how societies remember, record, and come to terms with moral transgressions. Furthermore, the chapter demonstrates the broader cultural and moral implications of the Reverend's actions. While his deeds were personal crimes, the network of complicity among wealthy men reflects a society willing to subordinate ethics to convenience and advantage. The revelation of letters decades later forces a reckoning not only with the Reverend's sins, but with the silent enablers and systemic flaws that allowed the abuse to occur. In doing so, Chapter 5 underscores a universal theme. The passage of time does not erase accountability, and historical truth can emerge even when power and privilege initially suppress it. Finally, Chapter 5 concludes with reflection and caution. It leaves readers to grapple with the lasting impact of these events on the community, the victims, and the historical record. The letters and documents serve as a testament to the horrors of unchecked power, the vulnerability of children, and the moral compromises individuals are willing to make in pursuit of survival or gain. Yet they also stand as a reminder of the enduring value of truth, historical inquiry, and the courage required to confront uncomfortable realities. In revealing the Reverend's crimes long after his death, Chapter 5 transforms a hidden, shameful story into a cautionary lesson about morality, power, and memory. Chapter 7 shifts the narrative from immediate tragedy to the long-term psychological and social consequences of the Reverend's actions. With the death of one daughter in Chapter 6, the household is plunged deeper into despair. This chapter examines how fear, guilt, and secrecy continue to dominate the lives of the remaining daughters, while the Reverend's public image remains largely untarnished. It also begins to explore the wider societal context, showing how silence, complicity, and power structures allowed abuse to flourish. The chapter opens with the remaining daughters struggling to process their sister's mysterious death. Their grief is compounded by terror. The death serves as both a warning and a grim confirmation of the consequences of disobedience or resistance. The narrative describes their daily lives under the oppressive atmosphere of the household, constant vigilance, suppressed emotions, and the unspoken rules that govern their existence. The daughters learn that their survival depends not only on obedience but also on the ability to conceal their own suffering. Chapter 7 delves into the psychological tension that arises from this forced silence, highlighting how fear can become a tool of control in abusive environments. Meanwhile, the Reverend continues to maintain his outwardly pious and respected image in the community. He delivers sermons that speak of morality, virtue, and divine guidance, all while hiding his ongoing moral failings. This duality, the contrast between public righteousness and private depravity, remains central to the chapter. The narrative carefully portrays the cognitive dissonance that allows the Reverend to rationalize his actions. Gambling debts as unavoidable, his daughter's suffering as a necessary sacrifice, and the complicity of influential men as an unchangeable reality. Chapter 7 emphasizes how individuals in positions of power can manipulate religious authority and social norms to conceal crimes. The chapter also examines the daughters' inner conflict more deeply. They are caught between loyalty to their father and the instinct to reject the injustice they have suffered. Their faith, once a source of comfort and guidance, becomes complicated and painful. They begin to question not only their father's morality, but also the moral framework they were taught to trust. Chapter 7 portrays this struggle with subtlety, showing how abuse can distort perceptions of morality, trust, and spiritual belief. The daughters' experiences reflect a broader theme of the narrative: the collision of personal suffering with institutionalized authority. In addition to the personal struggles of the family, Chapter 7 expands on the social dynamics surrounding the Reverend's household. Neighbors remain wary, witnessing strange behaviors and unusual visits but hesitant to intervene. The chapter examines the psychological mechanics of social silence, fear of retaliation, the desire to preserve social standing, and the pervasive belief that authority figures are beyond reproach. These dynamics illustrate how the Reverend's actions are reinforced and protected by the complicity of others, and how abuse can continue when society prioritizes reputation over justice. A critical aspect of Chapter 7 is the exploration of moral complicity among the powerful men who accepted the daughters as purity bargains. The chapter provides insight into their motivations, greed, lust, and self-preservation, and the way they leveraged their wealth and influence to ensure the arrangement remained secret. Through this, the narrative highlights the intersections of wealth, gender, and power in 19th century South Carolina. The Reverend's daughters, powerless to resist, serve as symbols of systemic oppression and exploitation. The chapter emphasizes the cruelty inherent in a society where vulnerable individuals could be traded to satisfy debts, while influential men faced no consequences. Chapter 7 also begins to hint at the potential for eventual exposure. While the daughters remain silent, the narrative foreshadows that history will later uncover the hidden truths. Letters, documents, and testimonies that surface decades later are suggested as seeds in this chapter, building anticipation for the later revelation of the scandal. This foreshadowing underscores the enduring importance of truth and memory, suggesting that even the most carefully concealed crimes may eventually come to light. The chapter's tone is heavy and introspective, focusing on psychological depth rather than action. It emphasizes the suffocating weight of secrecy, the fracturing of trust within the family, and the moral corruption that pervades the surrounding society. Readers are invited to reflect not only on the personal suffering of the daughters, but also on the systemic issues that allowed such abuse to occur. Chapter 7 portrays the insidious nature of silence, both imposed and voluntary, as a powerful enabler of injustice. As the chapter progresses, it highlights the growing tension within the household. The remaining daughters begin to subtly resist in small, non-confrontational ways, moments of private rebellion, fleeting expressions of anger or grief, or silent questioning of their father's authority. These small acts of defiance are symbolic, representing the persistence of personal agency even in the face of overwhelming oppression. The chapter carefully balances the horror of their circumstances with the resilience of the human spirit, showing that even in situations of extreme control, hope and self-awareness can survive. Chapter 7 concludes with a somber reflection on the consequences of unchecked power and moral compromise. The Reverend continues to thrive publicly, yet the family's inner world is irreparably damaged. The chapter leaves readers with an understanding of the full psychological and social cost of exploitation, emphasizing that the Reverend's actions have created lasting trauma, not only for his daughters but for the broader moral fabric of the community. The chapter serves as both a continuation of the narrative arc of personal suffering and a bridge toward the eventual historical reckoning, preparing the reader for the revelations that will unfold in subsequent chapters. In summary, Chapter 7 is a detailed exploration of fear, silence, and moral complexity. It examines the daughters' inner lives, the mechanisms of societal complicity, and the corruption inherent in the Reverend's dual existence. Through careful attention to psychological detail and social context, the chapter emphasizes the enduring impact of abuse and the ways in which power can perpetuate injustice. It balances tragedy with subtle hints of resilience, setting the stage for the eventual exposure of long-hidden truths and the moral reckoning that follows. Chapter 8 represents a turning point in the narrative, shifting from the private suffering of the Reverend's daughters to the gradual emergence of suspicion and the first inklings of public scrutiny. Up until this chapter, the family's torment has been largely contained behind closed doors, protected by the Reverend's public image and the social deference of the community. Now, however, the consequences of secrecy and exploitation begin to ripple outward, threatening to expose long-hidden truths. The chapter opens with a detailed depiction of the Reverend's household after the death of his daughter. The remaining girls live under heightened tension, aware that their sister's death has sparked rumors among neighbors, albeit whispered ones. These murmurs, though indirect, mark the beginning of cracks in the carefully maintained facade of piety and respectability. The narrative emphasizes the psychological burden this places on the daughters. They must navigate not only their father's oppressive control, but also the fear that their private suffering may be discovered by the outside world. Chapter 8 examines the corrosive effect of prolonged secrecy on the family, highlighting how constant vigilance and silence create layers of trauma. As rumors begin to circulate, the Reverend himself becomes increasingly anxious. Though he masks it behind the rituals of public preaching and church duties, his outward confidence contrasts sharply with his inner fear that exposure could destroy his reputation, social standing, and access to wealth. This chapter delves into the duality of his existence. A man who preaches morality while secretly terrified of being held accountable for immorality. The narrative explores how such fear can intensify moral corruption, prompting further desperate measures to maintain appearances. Neighbors' perspectives are given greater attention in Chapter 8, illustrating the social dynamics that both enable and constrain action. The community is depicted as a web of observation, suspicion, and caution. People notice the patterns of visitors, the sorrow in the daughters' faces, and the unnatural quiet surrounding the household. Yet social norms, fear of reprisal, and the Reverend's respected position prevent them from intervening directly. This tension between awareness and inaction is central to the chapter's theme, the societal complicity that allows abuse to continue. It demonstrates how power, reputation, and fear intertwine to protect perpetrators while silencing victims. Chapter 8 also explores the daughters' evolving awareness of their own exploitation. As they observe the suspicious behaviors of outsiders and recognize the inconsistencies in their father's public versus private actions, they begin to understand the broader implications of their situation. This growing awareness introduces a subtle sense of agency. While still constrained, the daughters start mentally questioning their father's authority, the morality of the purity bargains, and the justice of a society that permits such arrangements. Their internal struggle is portrayed with nuance, highlighting the tension between obedience and emerging self-recognition. Key focus of the chapter is the role of influential men who accepted the daughters as payment. The narrative details their ongoing complicity and the lengths they go to maintain secrecy. Through this lens, Chapter 8 examines the systemic abuse of power in 19th century America. Wealth, social influence, and gender hierarchies create a protective shield around the Reverend and his associates. The chapter emphasizes the insidious nature of exploitation when it is normalized or condoned by social elites, highlighting how vulnerable individuals, particularly women and children, can become trapped in cycles of abuse. At the same time, Chapter 8 introduces subtle hints of historical evidence that will later confirm these abuses. The narrative foreshadows the discovery of letters, journals, and legal records that detail the transactions, names of participants, and agreements made. These elements of foreshadowing serve two purposes. They reinforce the inevitability of eventual exposure, and they underscore the importance of documentation and historical memory in uncovering hidden crimes. By connecting private trauma to public record, the chapter begins to bridge the gap between past suffering and later societal reckoning. The chapter also explores the emotional landscape of the daughters in response to these early signs of suspicion. Their fear intensifies as they realize that even casual curiosity from outsiders could jeopardize the fragile control they have over their lives. At the same time, there is a faint glimmer of hope. The idea that secrets cannot remain hidden forever. This duality, terror and tentative hope, creates a complex emotional texture, portraying the daughters as both victims and emerging witnesses to injustice. Chapter 8 delves further into the moral contradictions of the Reverend himself. While he publicly condemns sin and advocates for spiritual virtue, privately he grapples with guilt, fear, and the escalating consequences of his previous actions. This inner turmoil adds depth to his character, showing that even those who commit atrocities are subject to psychological strain. The chapter explores how moral and emotional conflict can coexist with outward duplicity, providing readers with insight into the complex interplay between conscience and self-preservation. Finally, Chapter 8 examines the societal mechanisms that both conceal and reveal injustice. Through subtle narrative cues, neighborly whispers, suspicious observations, and small inconsistencies in behavior, the chapter illustrates how truth has a way of surfacing, even when suppressed. The chapter concludes with a sense of mounting tension. The Reverend's control is no longer absolute, and the first signs of reckoning, though distant, are beginning to emerge. This serves as a bridge to the later chapters, which will detail the exposure of the scandal and the historical documentation that preserves the story. In summary, Chapter 8 is a turning point that shifts the narrative from private suffering to emerging public awareness. It explores the daughter's evolving consciousness, the psychological weight of secrecy, and the social dynamics that enable abuse. The chapter highlights the fragility of the Reverend's authority in the face of growing suspicion and foreshadows the eventual uncovering of historical evidence. Through detailed attention to psychological, social, and moral dimensions, Chapter 8 deepens the narrative complexity, emphasizing the collision of personal trauma and societal complicity while setting the stage for eventual historical reckoning. Chapter 9 represents a critical turning point in the narrative, shifting the story from the immediate personal and social consequences of the Reverend's actions to the long-term historical revelation of his crimes. The focus moves beyond the household and contemporary witnesses to the discovery of documents decades later that expose the horrifying truth of exploitation, secrecy, and complicity. This chapter emphasizes the intersection of personal trauma, historical record, and the enduring impact of moral corruption. The chapter begins with the description of letters, journals, and other records discovered by researchers, historians, or descendants. These documents, written at the time of the events, provide first-hand accounts of the transactions, names of those involved, and explicit arrangements that had previously been hidden. The narrative emphasizes the shock and gravity of these discoveries, showing how they confirm long-suspected rumors and oral histories. For the daughters, long silenced by fear and social constraint, these letters validate their experiences, turning private trauma into documented history. Chapter 9 explores how the written record transforms memory and rumor into incontrovertible evidence. A significant portion of the chapter examines the content of these letters in detail. They reveal not only the mechanics of the purity bargains, but also the mindset of the Reverend and the powerful men who benefited from the arrangement. Through these documents, readers gain insight into the cold, transactional nature of the deals, the rationalizations offered by the Reverend to justify his actions, and the complicity of wealthy and influential men. Chapter 9 carefully analyzes these aspects, emphasizing how moral corruption was interwoven with social and financial considerations. The letters demonstrate that the abuses were neither random nor isolated, but systematic and deliberate, reflecting broader social hierarchies and gender dynamics in 19th century South Carolina. The chapter also delves into the psychological and emotional aftermath for the daughters, who, even decades later, must confront the historical record of their own exploitation. Reading the letters provides a sense of vindication, but also reignites trauma. Chapter 9 explores this complex interplay of relief, anger, sorrow, and empowerment, showing how survivors navigate the documentation of crimes committed against them. The chapter underscores that historical revelation is not merely an academic exercise. It has deeply personal and emotional resonance for those who lived through the events or their immediate consequences. Chapter 9 further situates the scandal within the wider social and historical context. It examines the role of power, wealth, and authority in enabling the Reverend's actions and protecting him from contemporary scrutiny. By revealing names and specific arrangements, the letters highlight the network of complicity that allowed the abuse to continue. The chapter emphasizes that this was not merely an isolated family tragedy, but a reflection of broader systemic issues, including the subjugation of women, the manipulation of religious authority, and the ways social hierarchies shielded the guilty. In addition to exposing the Reverend and his associates, the letters also shed light on the limitations of 19th century law and social norms. Chapter 9 explores how legal frameworks, community standards, and cultural expectations often failed to protect vulnerable individuals. The narrative examines how silence and fear were enforced not just by the Reverend, but by societal structures that prioritized reputation, authority, and wealth over justice. This adds another layer to the story, showing that personal crimes cannot be separated from the social systems that allow them to persist. The chapter also emphasizes the contrast between private suffering and public facade. The letters provide evidence of the dichotomy that had existed for decades: the Reverend's public image as a moral and devout man versus the private reality of manipulation, exploitation, and despair within his household. Chapter 9 uses this contrast to explore themes of hypocrisy, moral blindness, and the power of reputation to conceal truth. The documents serve as an unflinching counterpoint to the Reverend's sermons, forcing both readers and historians to confront the depth of his duplicity. Chapter 9 also examines the moral implications for the men who benefited from the daughters' exploitation. By revealing their names and roles, the letters challenge readers to consider questions of accountability, justice, and historical responsibility. These revelations highlight the enduring tension between private power and public morality, illustrating how abuse is often enabled by those who choose self-interest over ethical action. The chapter invites reflection on how society continues to grapple with complicity, privilege, and the protection of perpetrators. Finally, Chapter 9 concludes by reflecting on the broader significance of uncovering historical evidence. The letters serve as a testament to the resilience of memory, the importance of documentation, and the ways in which the truth can survive even in the face of deliberate concealment. The chapter emphasizes that exposure of hidden crimes, even decades later, is essential for both justice and historical understanding. It leaves readers with a sense of resolution in terms of revelation, while also acknowledging the lasting impact of trauma on the daughters and their descendants. In summary, Chapter 9 is a detailed exploration of historical exposure, moral reckoning, and the enduring consequences of abuse. It examines the discovery of letters and documents that reveal the transactions, complicity, and corruption that characterize the Reverend's household. The chapter balances personal trauma with societal analysis, showing how private suffering intersects with systemic injustice. Through meticulous attention to detail, it emphasizes the power of historical evidence to validate survivor experiences, confront hypocrisy, and illuminate broader social dynamics. Chapter 9 serves as a bridge between the private horrors of the past and the public recognition of truth, setting the stage for the final reckoning in Chapter 10. Chapter 10 serves as the culmination of the narrative, bringing together the threads of personal suffering, societal complicity, and historical revelation. It focuses on the aftermath of the discovery of the letters and documents that exposed the Reverend's actions and the broader scandal that had remained hidden for decades. This chapter examines the consequences for all involved, survivors, perpetrators, and the community, and explores the enduring impact on history, memory, and morality. The chapter begins by detailing the public and private responses to the letters discovered decades later. Historians, researchers, or descendants who uncover the correspondence are confronted with evidence that confirms long-suspected rumors about the Reverend's exploitation of his daughters. The letters reveal the mechanics of the so-called purity bargains, including the names of wealthy and influential men who accepted the daughters as collateral for debts. Chapter 10 portrays the shock and horror of these discoveries, emphasizing how documentation can bring hidden truths into stark relief. This moment serves as both a revelation and a moral reckoning, forcing readers to confront the scale of abuse and the complicity of those who enabled it.